Hello, this is Chris Wilhelm, and for the next hour, I'll be reading from the Friday, May 22nd issue of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Our first article today, Republicans delay budget votes as they balk at Trump's fund. The GOP abandoned its plan to quickly pass a $72 billion immigration crackdown bill as senators revolted over his plan to pay people who claim government persecution. By Michael Gold and Carl Hulse. Senate Republicans abruptly abandoned plans to take up a filibuster-proof bill on Thursday to fund President Trump's immigration crackdown, a stunning turn demonstrating that members of his own party were not willing to risk politically toxic votes to advance the president's personal agenda. Though senators had widely been expected to bring their legislation to the floor before a week-long recess, as Mr. Trump has demanded, GOP leaders were unable to overcome deep concerns within their own ranks around the president's plan to use a federal fund to pay people who claim to have been politically persecuted. While Republicans still plan to take up the measure when lawmakers return, the delay underscored a toxic dynamic between the White House and the GOP-controlled Congress just months before the midterm elections. Republicans had already appeared ready to jettison $1 billion for Mr. Trump's ballroom project that the White House had requested to include in the bill, after a small group of senators made clear they would not vote to advance it. But there was even wider opposition to a Justice Department fund that Mr. Trump has said he wants to use to pay people who claim to have been unfairly targeted by the government. As Republicans discussed a way to curb that fund, Todd Blanche, the acting attorney general, traveled to the Capitol and met with them for roughly 2 hours behind closed doors in an effort to defend it. The private meeting was highly contentious, according to people familiar with the session, who said that Mr. Blanche did not clarify any details on how the fund might function or offer satisfying answers to questions from many senators about the lack of guardrails around the money. It is in real trouble, and it should be, Senator Susan Collins, Republican of Maine, said in an interview shortly after leaving the session. Not long afterward, Senator John Thune, the South Dakota Republican and Majority Leader, told GOP senators there would be no votes on the immigration legislation until after the recess. The reservations in Republican ranks have been exacerbated by senators' widespread frustration over Mr. Trump's retribution-driven intervention in GOP primaries, which has threatened incumbents as well as political concerns that appearing to rubber stamp the president's pet projects could cost them support in competitive midterm elections. Speaking to reporters at the Capitol, Mr. Thune did not dispute that the president's political moves had helped to precipitate the legislative chaos that was unfolding on Thursday. It's hard to divorce anything that happens here from what's happening in the political atmosphere around us, Mr. Thune said. Across the Capitol, Mr. Trump suffered another striking setback when House Republican leaders abruptly canceled a vote on a resolution that would direct him to end the war in Iran or seek authorization from Congress to continue the military offensive. With Republican defections on the measure mounting and a number of GOP lawmakers absent, leaders lacked the votes to defeat it. The retreats on both the budget bill and the War Powers resolution reflect a pivot by congressional Republicans who have spent most of Mr. Trump's second term deferring to him unquestioningly. Facing strong electoral headwinds, vulnerable lawmakers would prefer not to have to answer for an unpopular war or the president's personal priorities, but they are being forced to weigh their own political calculations against Mr. Trump's demand for absolute loyalty. Passing a filibuster-proof bill so close to Election Day was always going to be a difficult task for Republicans. Though immigration has long been among the party's top polling issues, the GOP lost considerable support with voters after the killing of 2 American citizens by immigration officers in Minnesota. After Congress approved a spending bill that did not fund immigration enforcement operations, Mr. Trump urged Congress to pass legislation that would do so by June 1st. But the president made that task exponentially more difficult by insisting that the measure, which provides $72 billion for immigration enforcement, also allocate $1 billion for security enhancements for his prized White House ballroom project. Polling shows that the ballroom is unpopular with voters, and several senators have publicly opposed the funding. Many moderate Republicans in the House in competitive races also warned that they did not want to vote on the funding. The Justice Department's announcement of the special fund just days before planned votes on the immigration bill left Republican senators in an untenable position. Democrats quickly promised to force a vote on the Justice Department fund, which they criticized as an act of political corruption meant to benefit Mr. Trump and his allies during debate on the legislation. Republicans were exploring adding a measure to the immigration bill to limit the fund, in part because leaders were worried that if they did not, a Democratic bid to kill it could draw enough GOP support to succeed. Several Republican senators, publicly and privately, have expressed worry that the fund would be used to provide money to people who attacked police officers during the January 6, 2021 assault on the Capitol and were later pardoned by Mr. Trump. Lawmakers were both targets of and witnesses to the assault that day, and it remains a deeply emotional issue for many of them. One participant in the closed-door meeting with Mr. Blanche, speaking on the condition of anonymity, said most Republican senators were incredulous that they were just learning the details of the fund and noted a lack of criteria for any payouts, including a specific prohibition against paying anyone who had been involved in violent actions. Senators Bill Cassidy of Louisiana and John Curtis of Utah told reporters that they were concerned with the makeup of the fund's commissioners. In a one-page memo circulated to Republicans, the Justice Department said the fund would be run by 5 members appointed by the Attorney General, with just one chosen in consultation with Congress. The process that Republicans are using to muscle their immigration enforcement legislation through the Senate free of a filibuster, known as budget reconciliation, would allow Democrats to force a series of votes on the ballroom, the fund, and other issues during a marathon debate. Senator Chuck Schumer, Democrat of New York and the minority leader, said Republicans were trapped in a problem of their own making. They're just stuck because they're damned if they do and damned if they don't, he said. They're damned if they side with Trump because the American people hate what Trump is doing, by and large. GOP pulls measure to end Iran war, lacking votes to defeat it. House Republican leaders abruptly scrapped a planned vote on a measure to direct President Trump to end the conflict or win authorization for it, amid party defections and absences. By Megan Miniero, Robert Jimison, and Michael Gold. House Republicans on Thursday abruptly canceled a vote on a resolution directing President Trump to withdraw U.S. forces from Iran or win approval from Congress to continue the war, after it became clear they lacked the votes to defeat the measure. The retreat was a striking setback that exposed fractures within the GOP over the conflict at a moment when the party has begun pushing back forcefully on Mr. Trump and his agenda. It also marked the latest embarrassing blow to Speaker Mike Johnson, who has toiled to defeat efforts to challenge or limit the war in line with the president's wishes, but is contending with growing wariness within his party as the midterm elections approach and the realities of his minuscule majority. The decision to shelve the War Powers Resolution came after Republicans had lost control of the floor during an earlier unrelated vote, with several of their members defecting and several more absent. As the House chamber descended into chaos, leaders wary of risking another public defeat on a far more politically consequential vote abruptly scrapped the Iran war measure. The move came just days after a similar resolution moved ahead in the Senate when a handful of GOP defectors broke from the president and opposed the war. That vote indicated an increasing willingness by some members of the president's party to pressure him to end a conflict that a majority of Americans say is not worth the costs. Last week, a similar measure failed in the House by the barest of margins on a tie vote, leaving Republican leaders no room for more defections. They probably did it because they didn't have the votes, said Representative Brian Fitzpatrick, a Pennsylvania Republican who last week sided with Democrats in favor of a similar resolution and said he had planned to do so again on Thursday. I don't think they're going to have the votes when we get back. The next time they bring it, he added, it's passing. It was the fourth time Democrats had sought to challenge Mr. Trump's ability to wage war without congressional approval since he initiated the current conflict in late February. But with both chambers scheduled for a week-long recess in observation of Memorial Day, they will have to wait until Congress returns in June. The delay left Republicans in control of Congress flummoxed and lamenting the dysfunction that has taken hold on Capitol Hill as they struggle to govern. All I want is just one normal day, said Representative Virginia Foxx of North Carolina, who, in her role as the chairwoman of the Rules Committee, is in charge of controlling proceedings on the House floor. Just give me one normal day. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. DNC 2024 election autopsy reopens wounds of Harris loss. The report partly blamed aides to Joseph R. Biden Jr. and Kamala Harris for her defeat, but it was widely seen as a poorly executed examination, bringing fresh scrutiny to Democrats. By Shane Goldmacher, Reed J. Epstein, and Lisa Lehrer. The Democratic National Committee on Thursday released a nearly 200-page draft of an internal autopsy of what went wrong in the 2024 campaign, ending months of speculation that had created an embarrassing public spectacle for the party as it seeks to regain control of Congress. The draft report places blame for former Vice President Kamala Harris's defeat partly on former President Joseph R. Biden Jr.'s political operation, arguing that it did not position her for success in the race after Mr. Biden dropped out. It also critiques the Harris campaign for failing to distance itself from Mr. Biden and for not producing an effective strategy to make a dent in Donald J. Trump's rising approval ratings. The release was an extraordinary turn of events for the party, which all but trashed its own report as incomplete and inaccurate, releasing the document only after months of mounting headaches from keeping it secret. The episode drew unwanted attention to the committee's internal struggles at a time when it should be focused squarely on the midterms and preparing for the looming 2028 cycle. Democrats spent the day contending with what most agreed was a shoddy assessment of the 2024 cycle, stepping on a news cycle when Republicans in Congress were breaking with President Trump over a proposed $1.8 billion fund to benefit those who claimed they were targeted by the federal government. The document itself was widely mocked. Atop each page was a bright red disclaimer that the DNC was not provided with the underlying sources, interviews, or supporting data for many of the assertions contained herein. A page with the title Executive Summary was blank, except for a note in red reading, "This section was not provided by author." Particular facts included in the version that the committee released were highlighted in yellow and annotated as either unverified and inaccurate. There was no list of who was interviewed, no transcription, and no notes, which made determining the veracity of the draft all but impossible, said a person familiar with the process. The party first provided the annotated copy to CNN and then released the document itself. Despite its disorganization and empty sections, including those devoted to conclusions, the document includes a number of revelations, such as the fact that before the 2022 midterms, the Biden team had directed the party to poll on how Dr. Jill Biden, the First Lady, could help the president, and what issues and messages to emphasize. No similar polling was undertaken on Ms. Harris. It also describes sobering polling data that showed how pro-Trump advertising criticizing Ms. Harris for past comments defending transgender rights had been highly effective, with no answer offered by her campaign to counter it or change the subject. For months, Ken Martin, the party's embattled chairman, had resisted calls to release the report because he said he did not wish it to be a distraction from efforts to win seats in the midterm elections. But in recent weeks, the discourse about the autopsy itself, combined with the party's pallid financial state, ballooned into a sideshow that threatened to upend the National Committee's electoral priorities and prompted public and private calls for Mr. Martin to leave his post. On a call with committee members Thursday afternoon, Mr. Martin said that the release of the draft report would help end the long-simmering saga, and he acknowledged his role in it. "I apologize," he said. "Being a leader at every level means you own every single mistake, those of your creation and those not of your creation. This was a major mistake. I own it, and now it is time for us to move forward at the DNC." Many Democrats were alarmed at the poor financial state of the party. On Wednesday, the DNC's latest financial report showed it had $3 million more in debts than cash on hand. The Republican National Committee, in contrast, has $123.9 million on hand and no debts. Some called on Mr. Martin to resign on Thursday, including David Hogg, a former committee vice chairman who clashed with Mr. Martin last year before he was pushed out, and Dan Pfeiffer, a former advisor to Barack Obama and the host of an influential podcast listened to by many Democratic activists, Pod Save America. Mr. Martin's allies rallied to his defense and urged the party to move on, with party officials circulating talking points for committee members to use in his defense. The DNC plays a relatively marginal role in midterm elections, but will begin overseeing the presidential nominating process in 2027, including primary debates, and then serve as a key player in 2028. Mr. Martin had entrusted a longtime ally, Paul Rivera, to oversee the autopsy, but Mr. Rivera's final product wasn't ready for prime time, not even close, Mr. Martin wrote in a Substack post on Thursday. Mr. Rivera declined to comment. Many party leaders already felt limited confidence in Mr. Martin's ability to steer the party through what is expected to be a crowded 2028 presidential primary campaign. Thursday's report shook them anew, several said. They spoke anonymously to discuss private deliberations. Top Democrats were nervous about the autopsy even before the draft report's release. Governor Josh Shapiro of Pennsylvania recently spoke with Mr. Martin. In that conversation, which was first reported by NBC News, Mr. Shapiro conveyed his unhappiness with the lack of transparency around the release of the report and how the controversy was being handled, according to an official familiar with the conversation who requested anonymity to describe a private conversation. The draft report blames both the Biden and Harris campaigns for failing to successfully drive a negative view of Mr. Trump, writing that Democrats chose not to engage in negative advertising at the scale required. It was essential to prosecute a more effective case as to why Trump should have been disqualified from ever again taking office, the report says. The grounds were there, but the messaging did not make the case. For the most part, however, the report's conclusions are limited, often veering into political cliches and hard-to-follow explanations. Democrats must organize everywhere to win anywhere through majority party strategy focused on everywhere cohesively, strategically, and decisively, concludes one section. The report notes the success of an ad run by the Trump campaign attacking Ms. Harris for past statements in support of transgender rights. The ad was very effective and the campaign was boxed, the report says, because the spot drove an economic ad that was effectively unanswerable, barring a change of position on the issue by Ms. Harris. In the aftermath of the 2024 election, the ad, which used the tagline, "Kamala is for they, them, President Trump is for you," became emblematic of Democratic failures. In several places, the report urges Democrats to eschew identity politics in favor of economic issues and cost of living concerns, praising the party's candidates in battleground states, including North Carolina and Arizona, who won races for governor and Senate in 2024 with such a strategy. The report makes no mention of Israel or Gaza, an issue that has fractured the party and prompted some liberal voters to boycott Mr. Biden during the primary campaign. Mr. Martin's handling of the episode, meanwhile, promising a report saying he wouldn't release it and then putting out a draft version with undermining annotations, has raised new questions about the leadership of the party. When you're in a hole, you have to stop digging, said Devin Remacher, the chairman of the Democratic Party of Wisconsin. Now that Ken Martin has put down the shovel, he has to dig out of the hole and climb out. There are a lot of folks that have to have trust rebuilt with Ken and the DNC. Mr. Martin seemed to acknowledge the imperative to restore faith among grassroots supporters and major donors alike. Now we need to repair trust, he wrote in the Substack. I hope this is a start. California's governor signs AI order aimed at protecting workers. Governor Gavin Newsom issued an executive order to explore an overhaul of labor policies to deal with potential mass job displacement from artificial intelligence. By Cecilia Kang. California Governor Gavin Newsom issued an executive order on Thursday to explore a broad overhaul of labor policies, an attempt to front-run a potential mass job displacement caused by artificial intelligence. Mr. Newsom, a Democrat, signed the order mandating state agencies work with academics, labor groups, and the AI industry to study how to subsidize companies that keep employees rather than replace them with the technology. The order calls for an expansion of job training programs, particularly for white-collar workers like customer service representatives, software developers, and marketing and salespeople, whose roles are expected to be eliminated by AI. Mr. Newsom also ordered an examination of universal basic capital, which would give all residents stakes in assets like corporate stocks, bonds, or wealth funds. Unemployment insurance and other traditional safeguards will not suffice, Mr. Newsom has said. AI leaders have warned him of swift and major changes in employment, where entire job categories are at risk of extinction, particularly for white-collar workers. California has never sat back and watched as the future happened to us, and we won't start now, Mr. Newsom said in a news release. But we must think bigger. This moment demands that we reimagine the entire system, how we work, how we govern, how we prepare people for the future. Mr. Newsom's executive order, the first of its kind signed by a U.S. governor, reflects a growing global angst. Fears about AI have prompted a fierce debate over how best to help individuals transition into new careers or help those facing extended unemployment. On Wednesday, Meta slashed its workforce by 10%, or about 8,000 people, citing a further shift in the company's strategy to AI. It joined the chip company Intel, the software company Cisco, the e-commerce giant Amazon, and other tech companies that have laid off thousands of workers, as executives say the technology has created significant efficiency gains. Dario Amodei, co-founder of the AI startup Anthropic, has predicted that roughly half of white-collar jobs could disappear in the next 5 years. While other tech leaders disagree with Mr. Amodei's predictions, nearly all say that the technology will replace humans in fields like communications, law, and engineering in the future. Governments around the world are responding to AI-related job losses with an array of actions and experiments. In China, which currently has a 17% youth unemployment rate, courts have ruled in favor of workers who have sued their former employers for compensation after being displaced by AI. England, Japan, and South Korea have contemplated universal basic income, a policy giving regular cash handouts to residents to make up for labor market disruptions. In the United States, some Democratic lawmakers have also floated legislative proposals for similar pilot projects. Tech leaders, including Elon Musk of Tesla and SpaceX and Sam Altman of OpenAI, have said universal basic income may be needed. Mr. Musk has said that productivity from AI will amount to a surge in funds available to governments that can be used to compensate individuals who lose their jobs to technology. Universal high income via checks issued by the federal government is the best way to deal with unemployment caused by AI, Mr. Musk said in a post last month. While Mr. Newsom's order directs policy exploration instead of concrete action, California has been a leading state in regulating AI. The state was the first to pass a comprehensive safety bill on large language models like OpenAI's ChatGPT, Google's Gemini, and Anthropic's Claude. Mr. Newsom recently issued an executive order to vet any companies with AI contracts with the state for privacy and security guardrails. California and other states have helped fill the void in federal regulation, in which the White House has largely urged free rein for the companies in a global AI race with China. That may change in the wake of Anthropic's powerful new model, Mythos, which has prompted White House officials to consider an executive order mandating safety testing for new models. In a speech this week at a conference held by the Center for American Progress, a left-leaning think tank and advocacy organization, Mr. Newsom said he was concerned that companies were getting tax breaks while workers were saddled with taxes on their wages. Tax breaks for companies that automate and displace employees will enrich companies, but doubly hurt workers, who are still subject to taxation. The governor's order does not specifically mention an overhaul of tax policy, but that could be considered as state agencies develop new AI-related labor frameworks, the governor's office said. Mr. Newsom's executive order predicts a widening gap between AI companies and workers as the industry explodes in profitability and laborers are increasingly left behind. In his order, the governor asked state agencies to focus on ways that collective bargaining by labor groups can help bridge the gap. Businesses are going to make a fortune, and that's why you cannot continue to have a payroll tax system that taxes jobs and then subsidizes automation, Mr. Newsom said in his speech this week. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Health experts stunned by Trump officials' strict quarantine measures. Public health experts say the administration's quarantine orders go beyond what is needed to prevent the U.S. spread of Ebola and hantavirus. By Apurva Mandavili and J.C. Fortin. Trump administration officials, confronted by overlapping outbreaks of Ebola and the hantavirus, have taken a more aggressive approach to locking down potentially exposed people than in past outbreaks, surprising many public health experts. The instructions from President Trump's top health appointees, some of whom were vocal opponents of the COVID-era public health restrictions, go well beyond tactics that were used to successfully contain previous outbreaks of the diseases. They include instructing more than a dozen people to remain in home confinement with twice-daily checks, quarantining 18 passengers from a hantavirus-infected cruise ship at a federal facility in Nebraska for 21 days, and keeping American doctors exposed to Ebola at foreign hospitals rather than repatriating them to specially designed U.S. treatment centers. I am utterly stunned by that, said Jennifer Nuzzo, director of the Pandemic Center at Brown University's School of Public Health. Many senior federal officials, including the Health Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr., have been staunch supporters of medical freedom, championing people's right to choose or decline medical countermeasures, including vaccines. Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, acting director of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, drew notice during the COVID-19 pandemic for suggesting that the coronavirus should be allowed to spread freely among healthy people, and for arguing that mandatory quarantines and lockdowns were harmful to society. Last week, however, he issued quarantine orders that cited public health laws for 2 passengers who wanted to leave the Nebraska facility and isolate in their home states. I think it's incredibly ironic that Jay Bhattacharya signed the quarantine orders himself, given how much of a devotee he has been to the notion that people should feel free to do what they want if they are sick, regardless of who may be harmed, said Gigi Gronval, a biosecurity expert at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. In a call with state officials on Monday, Dr. Bhattacharya said he supported medical freedom, but that the decision to keep the passengers in Omaha had come from the highest levels of government, according to people familiar with the matter who spoke on the condition of anonymity because of fear of retaliation. Dr. Bhattacharya did not specify who had made the decision or respond to a request for comment. The White House also did not immediately respond. Predicting the best course of action in an outbreak or other public health emergency can be difficult, though experts note that the United States has previous experience with successful containment of Ebola and the hantavirus, unlike with COVID-19, which was caused by a novel coronavirus. The cruise ship on which the hantavirus outbreak emerged, the Dutch-registered MV Hondius, began its journey in Argentina in early April. 3 passengers later died from the virus, and several others became ill or tested positive. The roughly 150 cruise ship passengers were back in their home countries by mid-May, including the 18 Americans who were taken to Omaha. At least 7 other Americans left the cruise earlier and returned home independently on commercial flights and are now being monitored by local health departments. Another 16 are being watched because they were exposed to an infected person during travel. Federal health officials said when the 18 American passengers arrived in Nebraska that they would need to be screened and monitored for several days, but suggested they could leave soon if they were not showing signs of infection. Dr. Bhattacharya said in interviews that the passengers would be handed off to state officials within a day or two. That plan seemed to change abruptly. 2 of the Americans who were planning to leave, including Angela Perryman, 47, received orders requiring them to stay in federal quarantine for at least 2 more weeks. Health officials told her they would contact law enforcement if she tried to depart before then, she said. We were told that if we exercised our right to leave, then we would be detained against our will, said Ms. Perryman, who remains in the facility and is threatening legal action. Federal guidance to states monitoring people potentially exposed to the hantavirus also seemed to become more restrictive. The agency initially suggested that states check in with those quarantining at home once a day by phone, text, or email. It also said high-risk contacts should avoid commercial flights, but could travel via chartered flight or personal vehicle and should limit their activities outside the home. But the CDC now says individuals with high-risk exposure should stay home and away from others. They may spend time outdoors within walking distance of their homes, the guidance says, as long as they avoid crowds and contact with other people. The new guidance also tightens monitoring, recommending in-person check-ins by local health agencies twice a day. You're actually putting health workers at risk by making them go in person to somebody's home that has a potential infection, said Dr. Deborah Horry, who had served as the CDC's chief medical officer before she resigned in August in protest of the Trump administration's actions. It's better to do the video monitoring. In practice, the protocol for monitoring people in their homes has differed from state to state. Texas is sending health officials in person to check on 2 people who were passengers on the ship, following the current federal guidance. In Kansas, 3 people who were not on the ship but crossed paths with the person who had the hantavirus are being observed at the University of Kansas Medical Center. In Georgia, the health department is making video calls twice a day to monitor 2 people at home. Our travelers are following this strictly, so they do not need to be forced to do so, according to a department spokeswoman. In King County, Washington, officials instructed those who are quarantining not to take Tylenol or other medicines that reduce fever so that they can accurately gauge whether they are ill. Hantavirus is a rare family of viruses carried by rodents that is most commonly transmitted to people through breathing in viral particles from dried rodent droppings or urine. Before this outbreak, there had been a total of 890 cases in the United States since surveillance began in 1993. About 35% of them were fatal. The Andes virus, found primarily in Argentina, is the only hantavirus species known to spread from person to person. Scientists who have studied hantavirus for decades agree that the Andes virus is not particularly contagious and is unlikely to lead to a bigger outbreak. The restrictive measures being followed by the Trump administration contradict the CDC's own procedures in 2018. The agency successfully contained a case of the Andes virus after a woman who had traveled to Argentina and Chile developed symptoms and, while ill, traveled on 2 domestic commercial flights. She was discharged from a hospital to her home after recovering. Officials tracked down 51 of the woman's 53 contacts and advised them to self-monitor their temperature daily for 42 days from their last contact with her. None became ill with the hantavirus. During previous Ebola outbreaks, U.S. residents exposed to the virus were evacuated back to the United States for observation or medical treatment. Taxpayer funds have been used to build state-of-the-art facilities to quarantine and treat Americans in just such circumstances, Dr. Nuzzo said. If we don't repatriate Americans in an emergency, what does citizenship mean, she added. I think it's going to erode confidence in government. Trump eases restrictions on climate superpollutants. The administration is delaying a phase-out of hydrofluorocarbons, potent planet-warming chemicals used in air conditioning and refrigeration. By Lisa Friedman and Maxine Joselo. President Trump announced on Thursday that his administration is easing restrictions on the potent planet-warming chemicals used in air conditioners and refrigerators, restrictions put in place because of a bipartisan law Mr. Trump signed during his first term. The move will slow plans to phase out hydrofluorocarbons, or chemical compounds sometimes called superpollutants, because of their enormous effect in driving climate change. The administration framed it as an effort to lower grocery prices that are testing voters' finances before November's midterm elections. Lee Zeldin, the Environmental Protection Agency administrator, joined Mr. Trump at the White House Thursday to announce the relaxation of requirements for grocery stores, air conditioning companies, semiconductor plants, and others to reduce production and use of the chemicals, which are also known as HFCs. Many Americans were expressing a lot of frustration and anger at this rushed, frantic, reckless sprint by the Biden administration to phase out reliable equipment for grocery stores, Mr. Zeldin said, adding the Trump administration is answering the call, which will lower the cost of living for hardworking American families. The administration said loosening the restrictions on hydrofluorocarbons would save businesses and families more than $2.4 billion. Mr. Trump faces growing political pressure to address the cost of living, especially as the war in Iran has driven up gas prices. But analysts said the move would do little to lower grocery costs, which are elevated because of tariffs, extreme weather, and soaring fuel prices since the start of the conflict in Iran. This move is highly unlikely to produce any noticeable reduction in grocery prices for consumers, said David Ortega, a food economist and professor at Michigan State University. We're talking about refrigeration, and that's a very small share of the overall cost of food. Dr. Ortega said that higher diesel prices in particular have raised the cost of the fresh fruits and vegetables that are either shipped or trucked into the United States. He added that, ironically, climate change is driving more severe droughts that have increased the prices of tomatoes and beef, among other items. The regulations that are being eased stem from a 2020 law that was seen as a rare bipartisan success in tackling climate change. It was broadly supported by industry, but groups that deny the established science of climate change have opposed it, and Project 2025, the conservative blueprint to reshape the government in Mr. Trump's second term, called for repealing the rule. Now the administration is blaming the Biden-era regulations for raising grocery prices, as well as making it more expensive to transport refrigerated goods to grocery stores and restaurants. The chief executive of Kroger, Greg Foran, said at the White House event that easing the rules would lead to cost savings for customers of the major grocery chain. We're concerned about the cost of living, Mr. Foran said, although he did not offer details on specific price cuts or timing. Mr. Trump, who has called climate change a hoax, said the rollback would raise no environmental concern. It's not going to have any impact on the environment, he said. However, HFCs are a huge contributor to human-caused global warming. While they linger in the atmosphere for a shorter time than carbon dioxide, they are hundreds to thousands of times more potent at trapping heat. Phasing out HFCs worldwide could avert up to 0.5 degrees Celsius of global warming by the end of the century, which would go a long way toward keeping the worst consequences of climate change from becoming reality. More than 190 nations, including the United States, agreed to sharply reduce the production and use of hydrofluorocarbons. The Biden administration aimed to cut the production and consumption of HFCs by 85% by 2036. Doing so would eliminate the equivalent of about 3 years' worth of climate pollution from the electricity sector. But Mr. Zeldin has said that regulation did not give companies enough time to switch to other refrigerants. He said the industry had faced shortages that left families sweltering without air conditioning in the summertime. The EPA also maintained that if fully implemented, the Biden-era rule would make it impossible for grocery stores to afford equipment to store perishable foods and would cause semiconductor manufacturing to come to a halt. Air conditioning and refrigeration manufacturers had supported the original restrictions, saying less harmful chemicals were available and that a shift toward those alternatives was already underway. The original rule was also seen as a win for American companies like Honeywell and Chemours that produce and sell alternatives to HFCs. American manufacturers did what Congress and the first Trump administration asked them to do. They invested in new equipment, new refrigerants, new production lines, and American workers, said John Hurst, the executive director of the Alliance for Responsible Atmospheric Policy, an industry group. The administration has now changed course in a way that weakens those investments. Mr. Hurst and other industry leaders said they worry the Trump administration changes will cause prices to rise, not fall. That's because the law still requires EPA to reduce the production of HFCs, but extending the deadline for companies to replace or modify cooling systems could cause demand for the chemicals to rise in the meantime. One rule finalized on Thursday would extend deadlines for phasing out the use of HFCs and make a wider variety of refrigerants available to businesses. A second change would exempt the refrigerant transportation sector from a separate Biden-era rule that sought to reduce leaks of HFCs. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Mortgage rates, now 6.5%, hit highest levels since war began. The average rate on a 30-year mortgage rose amid growing concerns over inflation and as the war with Iran showed no sign of ending. By Emmett Lindner. The interest rate on a 30-year fixed-rate mortgage rose on Thursday to its highest level since the war began, upending several weeks of steady rates as the U.S.-Israeli war with Iran approached its third month without significant progress toward peace. The 30-year rate hit 6.51%, the mortgage finance giant Freddie Mac said. That's up from 6.36% the week before, and the highest since August. That rate was still significantly below the peak of 7.79% in October 2023. But the increase comes when consumers in the United States are grappling with more debt and higher prices due to constrained energy supplies. Disruptions in the Strait of Hormuz, a vital oil passageway in the Persian Gulf, has choked off about 20% of the world's oil supply since the war began on February 28th. That has spiked costs on everyday items, including fuel and groceries. On Thursday, the average price for a gallon of regular gasoline in the United States was $4.56, according to the AAA Motor Club. That was 53% higher than before the war began. The S&P 500 dipped briefly after the mortgage rate was announced at noon Thursday. Investors have grown increasingly anxious about rising inflation. This week, bond markets pushed the rates on U.S. Treasuries to levels not seen since the global financial crisis nearly 20 years ago. A report from the Bureau of Labor Statistics said last week that wholesale prices rose in April at their fastest rate in 4 years. Earlier government data showed that inflation had risen at its fastest pace in nearly 3 years. Mortgage rates are influenced by yields on the 10-year Treasury note, which rose last week to the highest level since July, after data pointed to accelerated inflation rates. This week, the yield on the 30-year Treasury note also spiked to its highest point since 2007. The rising rates are pushing up borrowing costs for governments, homeowners, and businesses. Exxon may return to Venezuela, ending a long fight with its leaders. The U.S. oil giant is negotiating a deal to pump oil in Venezuela, ending a standoff with its socialist rulers and marking a victory for President Trump. By Anatoly Kurmenev. The largest U.S. energy company, ExxonMobil, is in talks to acquire rights to produce oil in Venezuela nearly 2 decades after it was effectively expelled from the country, according to several people familiar with the matter. The deal would be a major victory for President Trump, who has declared the country's vast natural wealth open to American businesses. If finalized, the deal would mark Exxon's return to a country with one of the world's largest oil reserves after years of legal battles that had turned the oil giant into a nemesis of Venezuela's ruling Socialist Party. As recently as January, Exxon called Venezuela uninvestable. After deposing the nation's leader, Nicolas Maduro, Mr. Trump installed Mr. Maduro's vice president to manage Venezuela's economic opening to the United States. The deal, which could be finalized and announced as soon as this month, would involve Exxon signing contracts to produce oil in up to 6 fields in several regions in Venezuela, according to the people familiar with the matter. They spoke on the condition of anonymity because they were not authorized to speak publicly about private discussions. An Exxon spokesman declined to comment. Venezuela's government and state oil company did not respond to requests for comment. Any deal between these two arch-enemies of the global oil industry, Exxon and the Venezuelan government, would be a milestone in Ms. Rodriguez and Mr. Trump's campaign to turn Venezuela into an economic partner of the United States after decades of rivalry. Venezuela has on 2 occasions in past decades nationalized foreign oil ventures, including Exxon's assets. A deal would also mark a sharp turnaround in Exxon's position toward the country where it first began working in the 1940s. In 2007, Mr. Maduro's predecessor as president, Hugo Chavez, nationalized oil projects owned by Exxon and other foreign oil companies. Breaking with most of its peers, Exxon refused to negotiate, left the country, and began a protracted legal battle in international courts. Venezuela's government still owes Exxon roughly $1 billion in damages awarded in those cases. After leaving, Exxon poured investments into Venezuela's neighbor and rival, Guyana, and began developing major oil fields in an area of the Atlantic that Venezuela has claimed. Exxon's dominant economic role in Guyana made it a frequent foil for attacks by Mr. Maduro, who accused the company of sponsoring a hostile government. In recent years, Exxon's executives had rebuffed efforts by Ms. Rodriguez, who ran Venezuela's oil industry under Mr. Maduro, to entice the company back into the country, according to a person familiar with those offers. During a high-profile meeting of oil executives on January 9th, 6 days after Mr. Maduro was removed, Exxon's chief executive told Mr. Trump that Venezuela was a major business risk. "We've had our assets seized there twice, and so you can imagine to re-enter a 3rd time would require some pretty significant changes," the executive, Darren Woods, said then. He has softened his position since. Mr. Woods told analysts in a call this month that the company's experience producing ultra-heavy oil in Canada gave it an advantage in Venezuela, where most of the oil has similar properties. "The investment and the returns look promising," he said of Venezuela, "and so I feel positive about what's happening, the opportunity there." Several things have changed since Mr. Woods dismissed Venezuela in January. The war in Iran has raised global oil and gas prices, making investments in production in different markets more attractive. The Middle East turmoil has also brought urgency to oil companies' efforts to diversify production sources. And last month, Exxon's main rival, Chevron, announced a major expansion of its largest oil field in Venezuela, a move that is expected to solidify the company's grip on one of the world's largest oil deposits. Several oil analysts said Chevron's expansion has made it strategically more costly for Exxon to continue ignoring Venezuela. It is unclear if the initial deal under negotiation between Exxon and Venezuelan officials would contain binding obligations or merely represent the company's expression of interest. Ms. Rodriguez overhauled the country's oil law in January to make the country more attractive to private investors, but is still finalizing a new type of contract for oil producers. One person familiar with Exxon's dealings in Venezuela said the company's negotiators had been aggressively pursuing business in the country in recent weeks and have prioritized a major entry over incremental deals. A second person said a group of Exxon employees flew to Caracas, in the capital, in April to evaluate the oil fields on offer. Ms. Rodriguez's administration has pursued a deal with similar urgency, said a third person. That person said the return of a company that in popular imagination embodies American oil power is a cornerstone of Ms. Rodriguez's efforts to attract investment and curry favor with the Trump administration. Ms. Rodriguez's pursuit of the Exxon deal has become a top priority, pushing aside advancing domestic laws on oil investments or attracting other major Western energy companies, the person added. When humans went away, the wildlife strayed. When people disappeared from the landscape, as they did during the pandemic, wild animals changed how they used space and resources, scientists found. By Emily Anthis. Humans do not have to cut down trees or build roads to disrupt wildlife. Their mere presence in a landscape can change how wild animals use space and resources, according to a new analysis of human and animal movements during the COVID-19 pandemic. The researchers paired GPS tracking data from 37 species of wild birds and mammals with cell phone location data across the United States. For 2/3 of those species, the presence of humans appeared to affect how much geographic space the animals used or how varied their environments were, the researchers found. But these human impacts were complex, and in many cases the effects of human presence were intertwined with the effects of landscape modification. For example, when humans disappeared, elk and mule deer expanded their land use. But these effects were more pronounced in rural or undeveloped locations than in highly developed ones like cities. We really can't understand the full picture without information on both of these factors, said Ruth Oliver, an ecologist at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and a co-author of the new paper. Human activity also had different effects on different species. The ravens in Yellowstone are behaving really differently than white-tailed deer on Staten Island, said Scott Yanko, a research ecologist at Smithsonian's National Zoo and Conservation Biology Institute and a co-author of the study. The research, which was published in the journal Science on Thursday, was conducted by a large international team as part of the COVID-19 biologging initiative, which has been studying how animals responded to the pandemic-related slowdown in human activity known as the anthropause. Scientists have long known that as people and their settlements expand across a landscape, wild animals can dwindle or even disappear. But it has not always been easy to identify why this happens. Is biodiversity loss a result of changes to the physical environment, or is the simple presence of living, breathing humans enough to have an impact? Those questions have been difficult to answer, in part because these phenomena typically go hand in hand. There tend to be more humans present in environments like cities than in undeveloped ones, like protected forests. It has also been difficult to get the fine-scale data on human activity. The pandemic, during which human developments remained intact but people largely stayed home, provided an opportunity to disentangle these effects. Previous research has suggested that the movements of wild animals changed when strict lockdown orders were in effect. That research, however, used the strictness of lockdown policies as a proxy for human activity. In the new study, scientists used cell phone location data to measure human presence more directly. The researchers estimated how many people were physically present each week in census blocks across the United States in 2019 and 2020. They also collected data on the movements of more than 4,500 individual wild birds and mammals, which had been outfitted with tracking tags for other scientific projects before the pandemic hit. They assessed how much geographic area each animal covered on a weekly basis. They also investigated whether human activity was pushing wild animals into new types of habitats by tracking how broad their niches were, or the range of environments they moved through each week. An animal that stuck to one specific type of habitat, say cool, low-elevation locations with dense vegetation, had a narrow niche, while a creature that spent time in places with more varied conditions had a broad one. We're not just looking at how their movement changed, but how that movement is actually affecting their experience of an environment, Dr. Yanko said. Many species, including coyotes, moose, and wild turkeys, covered less area when more people were present, suggesting that humans were shrinking their living space. The effect was often amplified in undeveloped areas. That could be because animals living in more pristine habitats were more sensitive to people, the researchers said, or because the animals living in more developed areas had already reduced their space use as much as they could. But there was also considerable variation between species. For instance, human presence seemed to increase the amount of space used by gray wolves, which have long been hunted and harassed by humans. One possible explanation is that gray wolves may be traveling longer distances in an effort to avoid potentially fatal encounters with people. The consequences of these behavioral changes remains unknown. Is this evidence of them successfully adapting to us, or is this evidence of pressure on them? Dr. Oliver said. That's what the researchers are hoping to explore next. But even the current findings suggest that effective wildlife conservation will require understanding and addressing both habitat modification and human presence. They also raise the possibility that even modest short-term changes to human activity, such as restricting access to a particularly critical animal habitat during breeding or migration season, could yield significant conservation benefits. There's the opportunity for coexistence in a smart, nuanced way, Dr. Oliver said. You've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the Friday, May 22nd issue of the New York Times. Your reader has been Chris Wilhelm. Thank you for listening.